Some people in Harwick County said Miriam Dunbar was too stubborn to grieve properly. Others said she was too capable to be sympathized with. I have found over the years that a woman who refuses to be both pitied and dismissed at the same time tends to make her neighbors uncomfortable in ways they cannot quite name, and so they settle on stubbornness as the explanation. Aaron Dunbar died in the winter of 1885 of a lung illness that took him in 6 weeks. He left behind 80 acres of good bottomland along Granger Creek, a sound roof, a solid barn, 3 milk cows, and a wife who had been managing the practical details of their homestead for the better part of their 7-year marriage, while Aaron devoted his considerable energy to the dreaming side of farming. Miriam had kept the books, negotiated the grain sales, maintained the equipment ledgers, and planted the kitchen garden that fed them through every lean season. She had done all of this without ceremony and without complaint, because it was work that needed doing and she was the one who did it well. After Aaron died, she continued. It was not stubbornness. It was simply the logical extension of what she had already been doing. But Harwick County did not see it that way, and by the spring of 1887, 2 planting seasons after Aaron's death, Miriam Dunbar had accumulated a particular and precise list of 7 people who had each told her, in their own specific way, that what she was doing was impossible, inadvisable, or improper. She kept the list the way a good farmer keeps a ledger, not out of bitterness, but because a clear record was more useful than a vague sense of injury. Fletcher Paige had been watching the Dunbar place from his property line for 3 weeks before he finally rode over one Tuesday afternoon in late April. He was 42 years old, lean and deliberate in his movements, a man who had spent enough time alone that he had lost the habit of unnecessary words. He had come to the Dunbar homestead because of the south pasture, which shared a fence line with his own north grazing land, and which he had reason to believe sat above a reliable water source. He had come prepared to make a reasonable offer. What he found was Miriam Dunbar in a canvas work apron, replacing a split fence post with the steady efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. She was 35 years old, dark-haired, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to measure their energy carefully. She did not stop working when he rode up. She said without looking away from the post, "You're Fletcher Paige from the north section. You've been riding past this fence line 3 times a week for a month. That tells me you want something from this land. Before you tell me what it is, I'd like to tell you something first." Fletcher dismounted and held his reins. He said, "All right." Miriam set the post tamper down, finally looked at him and said, "There are 7 people in this county who have told me I cannot run this homestead alone. I keep a list of their names and their specific reasons. I have found that a precise accounting is considerably more useful than simply absorbing the general feeling that I am incapable and letting it take hold. I tell you this now because whatever you have come to propose, I would rather know from the beginning whether you intend to be the 8th name." Fletcher Paige looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Who's the first one?" Miriam looked at him carefully, searching for the particular expression she had come to recognize, a performance of openness that eventually gave way to the same conclusion everyone else had reached. She did not find it. She found instead the face of a man who had asked a genuine question, and appeared to be waiting for a genuine answer. She said, "You might want to sit, it takes a while." Fletcher sat on the fence rail she had just repaired. He said, "I have most of the afternoon." The first name on the list was Aldous Britton, who managed the Harwick Savings and Agricultural Bank and who had refused Miriam's application for an operating credit line in the spring of 1886, citing as his reason that an unaccompanied widow lacked the collateral stability required for agricultural lending. He had said this to her face across a desk, with the particular confidence of a man who had never considered that the statement might be examined. Miriam said, "He told me that a woman managing land alone was a credit risk the bank could not absorb, that my acreage, my equipment, 2 seasons of receipts and a clear deed were insufficient without a male cosigner." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Aldous Britton approved a credit line for Dale Pershing last year at twice the amount you likely requested. Dale Pershing has not planted a profitable crop since 1882. I know this because Dale Pershing owes money to half the men in this township, and has been attempting to borrow from the other half." If Aldous Britton's concern was risk, Mrs. Dunbar, he was not looking very carefully at the evidence in front of him. I suspect he was looking at something else entirely. The second name was Stuart Dunbar, Aaron's younger brother, who had arrived from Missouri 6 weeks after the funeral and stayed for nearly a month, during which time he had reorganized the tool shed, in a way that made it considerably less efficient, offered repeated advice on crop rotation that contradicted the specific conditions of Granger Creek bottomland, and ultimately proposed that Miriam deed the property to him for management purposes, offering in exchange to provide her a monthly stipend and, as he put it, remove the burden of the work from her shoulders. Miriam said, He told me he was protecting the family's investment. He told me Aaron would have wanted someone capable looking after the land. Fletcher said, I never knew Aaron Dunbar well, but I know Stuart Dunbar by reputation. He ran a dry goods operation in Abilene for 2 years before it failed, and a grain brokerage in Salina for 18 months before that one failed also. Whatever Stuart Dunbar's qualities may be, protecting an investment does not appear to be among them. I suspect Aaron would have wanted precisely what Aaron had, a wife who actually knew what she was doing. The third name was Hiram Peck, who owned the feed and supply store on the east end of Harwick's Main Street, and who had, beginning in the fall of 1886, been charging Miriam prices that were between 12 and 18% higher than what she had paid during Aaron's lifetime for the same goods. He had not announced this change. He had simply made it, apparently operating on the assumption that she would not notice. Miriam said, he assumed I did not keep purchase records. I have kept purchase records since 1879. Fletcher said, I know what Hiram Peck charges. I buy from him myself. What he charged you was not a market adjustment. It was a test of whether you were paying attention. He paused. The fact that you noticed and confronted him tells me considerably more about your fitness to run this operation than anything Hiram Peck has ever said about it. The fourth name was Leonard Pruitt, the county's agricultural extension agent, who had visited the Dunbar homestead twice at Miriam's request for advice on addressing a drainage problem in the North Field, and who had both times declined to engage with her questions directly, addressing his answers instead to Miriam's hired hand, a 17-year-old boy named Cal who was competent with horses and entirely inexperienced with drainage. Miriam said, he told Cal to redirect the field furrows east. Cal relayed this to me. I considered it, concluded he was wrong about the grade, redirected them north-northeast instead, and the drainage problem resolved itself within 1 season. Fletcher said, Leonard Pruitt's official advice cost the Holloway family nearly $200 in a failed irrigation project the year before last. His recommendations to the Bauer operation resulted in a soil erosion problem they are still correcting. I do not say this to be unkind to the man, but because it seems to me that a drainage problem you solved correctly by disagreeing with him is not evidence of your limitation. It is evidence of his. The fifth name was Orson Bly, a land speculator who had come to Miriam's door in the fall of 1886, with an offer to purchase the Dunbar homestead at a figure he described as generous, and that Miriam, having recently obtained a proper land appraisal, recognized immediately as 30% below market value. Orson had explained, when she pointed this out, that his offer accounted for the reduced productivity of land, managed without proper supervision, and that she ought to consider the security of a cash settlement against the uncertainty of continued independent operation. Miriam said, he was offering me charity dressed up as commerce, and he seemed genuinely confused when I declined it. Fletcher's expression shifted. He said, Orson Bly made a similar offer to the Hennessy widow outside of Caldwell 2 years ago. She accepted it. The land sold for 40% more than what he paid her within 8 months. He has made a practice of this with women managing property alone. He looked at Miriam with something that was not quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood of it. You were right to show him the door. The sixth name gave Miriam a brief pause before she spoke it. She said, my father Emery Quell came from Ohio in the summer of 1886. He stayed 2 weeks. When he left he asked me to come home with him. He said the homestead was beyond what any woman ought to manage alone. And that Aaron, if he had been thinking clearly, would not have left me in this situation without better provision. Fletcher did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was measured in a way the previous 5 answers had not required. He said, that one I find I cannot dismiss the way I dismissed the others, Mrs. Dunbar. A father watching his daughter work herself through a hard season alone is going to be afraid regardless of what the evidence shows. The fear is real even when the conclusion is wrong. He looked toward the south field for a moment. I will not tell you your father was mistaken to worry about you. I will only say that what he saw as a burden on you looked, from where I have been watching this place, considerably more like a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. Miriam said quietly, that is the first time anyone has offered my father even that much, Mr. Paige. He loves me. He simply could not see past his own fear to notice that the capability he was worried I lacked was the same capability I had been exercising for 7 years while Aaron made the plans. Fletcher nodded once and said nothing else about Emery Quell. The seventh name was Reverend Thatcher Miles of the Harwick First Methodist Church. It was the one that had cost Miriam the most, and she had not spoken it to anyone before this afternoon. In the early winter of 1886, Reverend Miles had delivered a Sunday sermon that addressed, without naming her directly, the situation of a widow managing property alone in language that strongly implied such an arrangement was spiritually irregular and practically dangerous. He had spoken of the importance of male guidance in household and agricultural matters, of the risks to a woman's reputation and character when operating without such guidance, and had concluded by encouraging the congregation to pray for those among them who found themselves in circumstances that made them, in his words, vulnerable to the particular temptations that attend isolation and independence. The entire congregation of the Harwick First Methodist Church understood precisely who he was talking about. Miriam said, "He never named me, he didn't need to." Fletcher's expression hearing this changed in a way none of the previous 6 names had produced. He was quiet long enough that Miriam thought he might simply choose not to respond. Then he said, "I was in that church that morning. I remember the sermon." His voice was level, but there was something beneath it held in careful check. A man who stands in a pulpit and questions a woman's character in front of her neighbors without the decency to name her, because he knows if he names her she can answer him, is not exercising spiritual authority, Mrs. Dunbar. He is exercising the particular kind of cowardice that hides behind a collar. He paused. "I have thought about that sermon more than once in the months since. I should have said something at the time. I did not, and I find I regret that." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You are the first person who has said that to me. Most people told me I was too sensitive, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded." Fletcher said, "He meant it exactly the way it sounded. A man who speaks carefully enough to avoid naming someone while making absolutely certain everyone knows who he means is not being misunderstood. He is being deliberately obscure about his courage while being entirely clear about his target." They had moved, during the recitation, from the fence line to the low stone wall at the edge of the kitchen garden, where the afternoon light was coming in long and even across the plowed rows of the south field. Miriam realized she had been standing for nearly 2 hours without noticing it. She sat on the wall. Fletcher remained standing but had turned to face the fields rather than her, which she understood instinctively as the posture of a man thinking, rather than the posture of a man preparing to leave. He said after a while, "7 reasons. I have been listening to them, and I find that not one of them, looked at plainly, says anything true about you or about this land." He turned back toward her. Aldous Britton was protecting a lending system that rewards men who hold property and penalizes women who manage it. Stuart Dunbar was protecting whatever claim he imagined he was owed from his brother's estate. Hiram Peck was testing whether you could be taken advantage of, and discovered that you could not. Leonard Pruitt could not accept that a woman's assessment of her own land was more accurate than his official recommendation. Orson Bly has made a business of finding women in exactly your situation and offering them less than their land is worth. Your father was afraid, and fear dressed itself up as fatherly concern. And Reverend Miles. He stopped for a moment. Reverend Miles preached a sermon about propriety to a room full of people who knew you were running a better operation than half of them, because the truth you represented made his ideas about what women could and should do considerably less comfortable to hold. He said it slowly, the way a man states figures he has checked twice and is certain of, and Miriam found herself listening to her own 7 wounds recounted in this new and careful order, unable to find a single point she would contest. She said after a silence, "You came here to talk about the South Pasture." Fletcher said, "I did. I still want to talk about the South Pasture. But I find I have considerably more respect for who I'm negotiating with than I did 2 hours ago." He explained then what he had come to propose. The underground water source he suspected below the South Pasture, if it proved to be what the geological survey suggested, ran beneath both their properties. He had a proposition, a shared improvement of the access point, split costs, shared use according to seasonal need, with her maintaining full ownership of her land and him maintaining full ownership of his. A practical arrangement between 2 neighbors who both had something to gain, and neither of whom needed to surrender anything to make it work. Miriam said, "I'll want to see the survey documentation." Fletcher said, "I brought it." She reviewed it there on the stone wall in the fading afternoon light, asking 2 questions that he answered without hesitation, and identifying one discrepancy in the boundary notation that he acknowledged, after examining it himself, she was correct about. When she looked up she said, "I'll agree to the shared improvement on the following conditions." She named 4. He agreed to 3 immediately and asked for a week to consider the 4th. She gave him the week. He came back in 4 days with a modification to the 4th condition that improved it, in her estimation, and she accepted. That was the beginning of what Harwick County spent the better part of 2 years watching, with the particular mixture of skepticism and fascination. Reserved for arrangements that don't fit available categories. Fletcher Paige and Miriam Dunbar were neither romantically involved, as far as anyone could determine with confidence, nor simple business partners, nor friends in any conventional sense. They were 2 people who had each decided that the other's judgment could be trusted, and who operated accordingly, which in Harwick County in 1887 was unusual enough to generate considerable commentary. The commentary was predictably unflattering to both of them. Aldous Britton, who had declined to extend Miriam credit on the grounds of risk, found himself facing a bank examiner's inquiry in 1889 over several overleveraged accounts, Dale Pershing's among them. The Harwick Savings and Agricultural Bank survived the inquiry, but Britain's reputation in the county business community did not fully recover. Stuart Dunbar wrote twice from Missouri asking Miriam for her thoughts on a land purchase he was considering. She answered both letters. Hiram Peck's feed store was eventually purchased by his nephew, who standardized the pricing and did a brisk business. Miriam noted, without particular satisfaction, that the purchase records she had kept during the overcharge period proved useful during the county commerce inquiry that preceded the sale. Orson Bly made a similar offer to a widow outside Meade County 2 years later. That woman had heard, through the practical information network that connected women managing land alone across the territory, exactly what Miriam Dunbar had done when Orson came to her door. She showed him out the same way. Reverend Miles preached no further sermon touching on Miriam Dunbar's circumstances or character. Whether this was because he had genuinely reconsidered his position, or because the Dunbar homestead's visible productivity made the sermon's argument increasingly difficult to sustain, Miriam chose not to speculate. She continued attending services. She sat in her usual pew. She greeted him civilly afterward and gave him nothing to work with. Emory Quell visited from Ohio in the summer of 1888. He spent a week, watched his daughter manage a working farm with quiet competence, and on the evening before he left told her that he had been wrong to ask her to give it up. He did not elaborate, he did not need to. She understood that for a man of his generation and his era, those words had cost him something real, and she accepted them with the full weight they deserved. Fletcher Paige and Miriam Dunbar were married in the fall of 1889, in a ceremony that Miriam insisted be small and that Fletcher characteristically had no objection to keeping small. She did not change the name on the homestead deed. He did not ask her to. The land had been Dunbar land. She had made it productive through 2 difficult years, and she saw no reason to revise the record simply because her circumstances had changed. She kept her ledger of 7 names for the whole of their marriage. The entries in the years after the wedding changed in character the way a well-managed farm changes in a good season. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the direction of something that has found its proper footing. The 7 names remained because accuracy required them to remain. Beside each one over time, Miriam added a brief notation of what had eventually become of the person who had doubted her. Not vindictively, because a complete record is more useful than a partial one, and she had always known the difference. I have told this story because it seems to me that the habit of people who have been told repeatedly they are incapable of something they are in fact doing successfully is that they begin to record the evidence. Not for others but for themselves. A private accounting held against the accumulated weight of other people's certainty. Miriam Dunbar's ledger was that kind of record. And what Fletcher Paige understood, from the moment he settled onto that fence rail and asked to hear the first name, was that a woman who keeps such a ledger is not nursing a grievance. She is maintaining her accuracies against the particular pressure the world applies to make her doubt it. Those are different things entirely. One turns inward and hardens, the other turns outward toward the truth and holds. Tell me in the comments, which of the 7 people on Miriam's list do you think revealed the most about themselves, and the least about her? And if you want another story about a woman whose steadiness outlasted every prediction made against her, the next one is waiting for you.